Hi, welcome to the first week of Art and History of Film. And this week we're going to be looking at the very beginning of our adventure in Art and History of Film. And so we're going to be looking at a little bit at the history of film and some of the earlier inventors, and then talking a little bit more about what makes film an art form. So these are our learning goals for this week, and these slides correspond to pages 1 through 16 in the textbook. And so, as with other new media, nobody was quite sure what to do with film when it was first developed. And so Thomas Edison and William Dixon created short films that would play in a kind of on a loop, as you can see with this cabinet. The film is on a loop, and it would just play over and over again, so people could go and put their 5 cents in and watch this short little film. And people would go in and watch these films in kinetoscope parlors, so you'd have a whole bunch of these lined up. But Edison really didn't think that it would be profitable to go any further with it. And then you had the Lumiere brothers as well, that also didn't see a whole lot of use for it. They thought people would tire of it very quickly, because there's all these new inventions that were happening at the time, and this was just another one. But I'm going to try to pronounce it in French. The cinématographe. That wasn't very good, but we'll keep going. Basically was a camera, a printer, and a projector all in one. And what was nice, it was portable, so you could take it outside. And so what they did is they filmed scenes of everyday life. And I've included a link here in the slides that take you to some of their early films. And you'll see that they're basically just people sitting there around a table drinking wine. They have people leaving the factory. And these films actually, though, were very popular with the general public. And then in the early 1900s, filmmakers started to experiment with telling stories in the films. And so these early films were more like stage performances, because that's what directors had access to up until this point. And so you'd have these short films that were created, maybe 10, 12 minutes long, and people would flock to movie theaters at this point called Nickelodeons, and these were not grand theaters. These could be a hall with seats. But they wanted to see films like Edward S. Porter's Great Train Robbery. And so if you want to check out one of the earliest film that tells a story, I have a link here to the Great Train Robbery that you can see. And so the question became, is this entertainment? Is this art? And so what we're going to be talking about in this class over this year is what about film makes it an art. And so 2 things that we're going to be looking at most is the form, which is the overall patterning of a film, the ways that parts work together to create specific effects, and also the style, so how different cinematic techniques are used. So you have things like mise en scène, which is how the entire film look is created. And so I included here, this is Georges Méliès's Trip to the Moon, very famous early film. And he controlled all parts of the process. This has very early special effects in it. But then you have cinematography, editing, and sound. These are all very important things that we'll talk about this semester. So where do films come from? Well, you have the imagination and creativity of writers and filmmakers. You have complex machines that capture and create images and sound. Of course, early films did not have sound. That did not come about until like the mid-1920s. And then you have companies and individuals that invest in the filmmakers and the film. films, especially nowadays, are very expensive, so you have to have investment upfront in order to make them. And so the illusion of film is that we're seeing a continual scene unfold, but actually film has what's called frames, and these frames are like little individual pictures, and you have 24 frames per second, and we see these frames as continuous because we have our visual system uses critical flicker fusion, which you're going to read about, and also apparent motion to see these as continuous even though they're not. Now digital cameras, right, the frame rate is still 24 frames per second, but it can be it actually can be changed to anything. And filmmakers have used this greater frame rate to their advantage. The other thing about this frame rate is that you may have noticed, and if you haven't, start looking for it, but in television shows and on films, you may, as you're watching a car drive away, it may start looking like the wheels are going backwards. And that's because the sampling rate of 24 frames per second is very close to the rate that the wheel is moving around. And this is something called aliasing. Okay, so basically we have a camera and a projector. The camera moves the film along at a rate of 24 frames per second. So a frame is moved in front of the aperture opens, picture's taken, aperture closes again, the film moves along. And then cameras, film projectors are kind of the opposite of that. So basically the frame moves along at 24 frames per second, and you have a light that's shining through it, and that's what gets projected to the screen. Early silent films were shot at different frame rates, some 16 to 19 frames per second. And this is why when they're played on a camera that does 24 frames per second, they look really frenetic and really fast. But when you slow them down to the frame rate that they're supposed to have, movement in them are normal. Okay, so as I noted before, we don't really use film that much, although there are still directors that like to use it because it does give them certain qualities. But these are different types of films, and I just wanted to point out here they were talking about the soundtracks. And so you can see here is the soundtrack on the 35 millimeter. So it's built in. And here is a stereophonic soundtrack here on this 35 millimeter. And then the soundtrack here is built along this side of the frame. And then finally, we've been talking about how most films are made digitally now. And so you have different digital formats. And these, you're probably familiar with these if you've uploaded videos to YouTube or other places. And so you have the most common use one is the 720 by 1280 pixels. And then you have the HD, which is the 1080. And so HD is 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels. And then you also have a super high def or a 2K format, and there's actually a 4K now too, that give you even more pixels. And the more pixels you have, the higher the resolution you have. All right, so that was just a quick review of what you looked at in the textbook. So have a look at the films that are in this presentation, and also remember to do the crash course videos that I've assigned, because those will add to the information, especially about early film. And please remember to write your 2 cents in the discussion board. and I'll see you guys next week.